I woke to the sound of pounding, the kind that rattles wood and nerves at the same time. For a moment, I thought maybe I had drifted into some half-dream because the room was still dark and cold, and I had barely fallen asleep. But then I heard Dad's voice on the other side of my bedroom door, sharp in that familiar way that once ruled my entire childhood. Get up, make coffee, set the table. Melanie wants the perfect sunrise view at 5. His voice carried no warmth, no hesitation, no holiday spirit. Just orders dropped into the darkness like I was a maid he had hired for the season. I pushed myself upright, disoriented, and blinking against the soft glow of the moon spilling through the curtain. It took a few seconds before everything from the day before slammed back into place. Dad and Melanie had shown up unannounced on Christmas Eve, around 10 in the morning, dragging suitcases and an entitled air that stretched wide enough to fill the entire cabin. I still remembered the cold air rushing in behind them as they barged inside. Melanie stepping ahead first, like she was appraising a vacation rental. "Harper, sweetie," she had said, "this place is cute." Cute, in her tone, meant lacking. They had made themselves comfortable from the first minute. Dad set his bag on my reading bench without asking. Melanie used my favorite wool blanket to wrap around her shoulders. They wandered through every room as if checking for flaws. And then, without a trace of embarrassment, announced they would be staying a few days. It was the kind of moment where politeness feels like a trap, and I felt myself slipping into old habits, the kind that made room for their needs and shut down my own. Dinner that evening had been the kind of Christmas Eve moment that should have been peaceful, maybe even nostalgic, but instead felt like being grated. Melanie had poked at her salad, saying the cabin kitchen seemed awfully limited for someone making a living online. David had laughed a little and said my YouTube channel was probably just a lucky trend. Nothing to plan a lifetime around. I smiled and kept chewing, swallowing both the food and the sting. It was a familiar rhythm, a childhood choreography I thought I had left behind when I moved out at 19. But I need to pause here for a moment, because if you are listening to this, I wonder where you are and what you are doing right now. For me, when this moment happened, I was sitting in my dark cabin bedroom in Oregon, wrapped in a fleece blanket, listening to the echo of my dad's footsteps walking away like he expected. Absolute obedience. After he walked away, the cabin settled into that eerie quiet that comes after someone's storms. Through it, I sat on the edge of the bed, with my feet cold against the wood floor, and tried to breathe slowly. My mind kept circling back to how he said those words. Get up, make coffee, set the table. Melanie wants the perfect sunrise view. He spoke as if I existed to meet her preferences, as if my sleep, my holiday, my peace meant nothing. It cut deeper than I wanted to admit, and all the old memories rushed in like a tide I had hoped was gone for good. I lay back down, trying to convince my body to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Each time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing them the day before, moving through my cabin like inspectors. Melanie had pointed out the narrow kitchen counters, the simple light fixtures, the rustic shelves I built myself. David had commented on my camera equipment and said it looked like a lot of money for someone chasing online views. They made themselves at home while making me feel like I was the guest, the outsider, the teenager with unfinished homework. By 2 in the morning, I had stopped pretending I could fall back asleep. I turned onto my back, letting out a long breath. Outside my window, the tall pines swayed gently, their shadows shifting against the sliver of moonlight. Normally, that sight calmed me. It reminded me why I chose this life, why I lived here most of the year filming my simple living videos, and let the wilderness soften the noise I grew up with. But even the trees felt distant that night. At 2:45, the weight in my chest grew heavier. Not fear, not sadness, something close to anger, except quieter and more settled. It was not the request for coffee that bothered me. It was the tone, the assumption, the way he still believed he had the right to command my hours, my body, my energy. It dragged an old memory up from a place I wished I had buried. I was 11, and a snowstorm had covered our driveway overnight. God woke me before sunrise, flicking on my bedroom light and telling me to get dressed. He needed to leave early for work. I remember running outside in thin socks because I couldn't find my boots fast. Enough shoveling heavy mounds of snow while my hands stung and stiffened in the cold. He stood by the front window drinking coffee while I worked. When I asked if I could take a break, he said being useful builds character. I learned early that his comfort mattered more than my needs. And hearing his voice outside my door at 1 a.m, ordering me around like nothing had changed, pull that old ache right out of hiding. By 3:30, I realized something important. I was not upset because he asked for coffee. I was upset because he believed he still owned my obedience. That part of me was gone. The cabin I built, the career I built, the peace I built, all of it came from walking away from that dynamic. And now he had walked straight into my sanctuary and tried to reset the clock. At 3:55, something in me clicked. Soft, but certain. I swung my legs out of bed, stood up, and felt the air shift around me. Fine, I thought. You want coffee? You will get coffee. By 4, I was in the kitchen. The dim light over the sink hummed gently as I reached for my French press. My hands moved calmly, not shaking, not frantic. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. On the top pantry shelf, tucked behind a jar of wildflower honey, was a glass container holding an herbal detox blend I rarely used. It was strong, bitter, earthy, completely harmless, but definitely not gentle on the stomach. A pinch of it, mixed into the dark roast coffee Dad always preferred, would not injure anyone. But it would make the morning memorable. While the kettle heated, I thought about the rest of the day, about how they had taken over my guest room without asking, about Melanie insisting she needed better lighting for her skincare routine, about Dad using my editing desk as a makeshift paperwork station. They had turned my home into their backdrop and expected me to revolve around their needs. And I had let them, because that habit sits deep in me. But right then, standing barefoot in my kitchen, listening to the kettle hiss, I felt that habit beginning to break. By 4:20, the coffee grounds and the herbal blend were mixed. I poured the hot water slowly, watching the steam rise. The smell filled the room, rich and sharp. Not pleasant, but not alarming either. Just enough to make a certain kind of point. At 4:30, I stepped outside onto the porch to set up the little wooden table that looked out toward the ridge. The air was crisp and icy, the kind that wakes you up faster than caffeine. I arranged the plates and mugs the way Melanie would want them, neat and symmetrical. The sky was still dark, but hints of deep blue stretched along the horizon. As I worked, I felt something steady inside me, like a quiet promise I was making to myself. This was not just about coffee. It was about boundaries, about reclaiming the space they walked into without respect, about reminding myself that I was no longer the girl who shoveled snow without gloves, because someone else decided she should. At 4:58, I stepped back into the cabin. The sunrise table was ready. The coffee was ready, and I felt ready too, in a way I had not felt in years. Because for the first time since they arrived, I was not reacting. I was choosing. And that choice felt like the beginning of something that would shape everything that came next. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the warmth of the kitchen, letting the quiet settle around me. The sky outside was still dark, and the air had that heavy silence before dawn. But inside my chest, something felt strangely steady. It surprised me how calm I was. Calm in a way I had not felt since they arrived. Calm in a way that carried its own kind of strength. I checked the time on the stove. It was a little after 4. The coffee was ready. The table was set, and for a brief second, I thought I might have a few minutes to myself. I reached for a glass of water, letting the cold settle in my throat, when I heard the soft creak of the stairs behind me. It was that slow, deliberate kind of creak that told me the person coming down was not tired at all, just irritated at being awake. Melanie stepped into the kitchen with her arms wrapped around herself, her robe tied tightly at the waist. Her hair was already brushed and smoothed, as if even at 4:40 in the morning, she needed to present herself like she was stepping onto a stage. She looked at the counter before she looked at me, and her lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile. More like she had discovered something to disapprove of. She walked toward the cups I had already placed on the tray, lifted one, inspected the rim, set it down, then picked up another. I watched her do it without saying anything. She moved like someone performing an inspection before a restaurant health grade. Finally, she glanced at me and said, "I hope these are clean." Last night, one of the water glasses had a spot on it. "Harper, you really should be more attentive when you have guests." Her voice carried that clipped tone that I had heard every hour since they arrived. A tone that suggested I had already failed at some invisible standard she had set. I simply nodded and said, "Everything is fine, Melanie." She made a small, amused sound under her breath and continued, glancing at the folded napkins and adjusting one by a 1/4 inch. When she touched the napkin again and shifted it even closer to her preference, something in me tightened, but I held my breath and let it pass. She moved toward the porch door and looked at the sky. When she saw the faint stretch of blue rising at the horizon, she clasped her hands. "Perfect. It will be gorgeous. I hope the coffee is strong. Richard cannot stand weak coffee." I did not answer, and she did not wait for one. She simply gave the table a final glance and walked away, the soft click of her slippers traveling down the hall as if she had completed an important task. The moment she was gone, I let out the breath I had been holding, standing in my own kitchen at 4:40 in the morning while someone judged. The alignment of napkins was not how I imagined Christmas morning, but oddly enough, I no longer felt that helpless frustration I used to feel. Something had shifted in me around 1 in the morning when Dad had banged on my door. And by 4, when I started making the coffee, that shift had settled into resolve. I turned back to the counter and adjusted the tray, checking the mugs even though I knew they were spotless. The smell of the blend drifted upward, earthy and fierce. I poured 2 cups and placed them on the small wooden tray, letting the steam rise into the air. For a moment, I wondered how this morning might play out, but I did not linger on the thought. Instead, I looked out the window at the faint glow reaching across the ridge, soft but certain. The day was coming whether any of us were ready for it or not. At 5 exactly, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. David walked into the kitchen, rubbing his face with both hands like he had only been awake for seconds. His hair was brushed back but uneven, the way he used to look when he had early morning meetings. He did not greet me or ask how I slept. He simply looked at the tray and then at me. "You should set up your camera. A sunrise shot would boost your channel. Views always spike around the holidays." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were offering a helpful tip, as if waking me at 1 in the morning and demanding I prepare breakfast. Scenery was some kind of collaborative opportunity. I stared at him, not sure how to respond. He had never understood my work. He never watched my videos unless it was to make a criticism, and yet here he was, suggesting I film content for views he did not even believe were real or meaningful. Something about the assumption that he knew what would help my channel, that he could shape the direction of my work the way he used to try to shape my life, made my stomach clench. "I do not need to film this, Dad. It is fine the way it is." He waved his hand like brushing away a fly. "Nonsense. People love sunrise shots. You are already up. Might as well make use of it." I felt my throat tighten, that familiar ache of wanting to be understood, and knowing I would not be. I steadied my hands on the edge of the counter and said softly, "I will handle my channel on my own." He paused for a moment, surprised. Then he shrugged and reached for the coffee. The steam curled around his fingers as he lifted the mug. He brought it to his lips and took a slow sip. For a second, his face remained still and unreadable. Then his shoulders relaxed, his brows lifted, and he let out a satisfied sound. "Finally, strong coffee. About time you figured that out." The smell of the herbal blend drifted faintly between us. I met his eyes and gave the smallest smile, the kind that does not reveal anything, but only acknowledges the moment. He did not notice the shift. He never did. He took another sip, longer this time, then reached for the tray and carried it toward the porch without waiting for Melanie. I watched him walk away, the steam rising behind him in the cold morning air. The table outside waited for them, bathed in the pale glow of a dawn that had not yet broken fully across the horizon. For a long moment I stayed where I was, letting the quiet wrap around me again. The day was beginning, and something in me, something I had kept locked down for years, was beginning too. Dad carried the tray outside and disappeared onto the porch, and for a moment, the kitchen felt strangely quiet, almost peaceful. I stood there, listening to the faint clink of dishes as he adjusted the setup. I had already arranged. Melanie's light footsteps followed a minute later as she joined him, her voice bright and overly sweet as she commented on how beautiful the horizon looked. I could picture her settling into one of the chairs, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, ready to enjoy the perfect morning she had ordered at 1 a.m. I stayed inside, leaning against the counter while the first streaks of pink began to stretch across the sky. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that I had delivered exactly what they wanted, while also reclaiming a piece of myself. It was petty, maybe, but it was honest. I had spent too many years swallowing things that hurt. This time, I did something that felt like standing up, even if they had no idea yet. Around 6, I heard a sudden scrape of a chair outside, following by Dad clearing his throat in that harsh way he did when something was wrong. I reached for a dish towel, pretending to tidy up, giving myself a second before stepping out onto the porch. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the fading glow of sunrise. Dad sat hunched forward in his chair, with his elbows on his knees. His face had gone pale, almost gray beneath the morning light. He pressed his hand against his stomach and let out a low groan. Melanie hovered beside him, wringing her hands dramatically, but somehow still managing to look displeased even through her concern. She turned toward me the moment she saw me. "Harper, what did you put in this coffee? There is something wrong with it." Her voice trembled just enough to sound worried, but her eyes had the same accusatory sharpness I had seen since they arrived. I walked closer and said calmly, "It is organic, Melanie. David said he liked strong coffee." She stared at me like I had personally sabotaged Christmas morning. Dad lifted his head slightly, his breaths short and uneven, his eyes narrowed as if trying to focus. Then he stood abruptly and stumbled toward the door. "Move," he muttered as he pushed past me, heading inside. He barely made it 3 steps before he quickened his pace down the hall. A few seconds later, I heard the bathroom door slam shut. Melanie spun back to me. "You need to take responsibility for this. He is in pain. He looks awful." "What kind of coffee did you make?" I folded my arms lightly, leaning against the railing, letting the morning air brush against my skin. Maybe it was the early hour or the buildup of the past day, but I felt no rush to soothe her. No need to apologize for something that was harmless and well within the bounds of what any store-bought blend could do. I said evenly, "You both wanted a perfect sunrise. You got it." He said the coffee was good, strong, and it is all natural. Nothing more. Melanie blinked, thrown off by how calm I sounded. Usually I cracked. Usually I apologize. Usually I rushed to fix things. But not today. She stepped closer as if trying to size me up. "This is unacceptable. Your dad is miserable. You need to figure out what you did." Her voice rose, but I did not. I simply watched her as she pressed a hand to her forehead, pacing across the porch in that restless way of someone used to getting what they want. Inside the cabin, I heard the faint sound of Dad's discomfort echoing down the hallway. It was not severe, not dangerous, just uncomfortable. And if I was being honest, a small part of me felt relief. Not because he was hurting, but because for once, his actions had consequences. He had stormed into my home, barked orders, treated me like staff, and expected the world to shape itself around his needs. This morning was the first time he had to sit with the impact of that. Melanie turned sharply toward me again. "Fix this, Harper. He cannot be like this all day. We have plans." I raised an eyebrow slightly. Plans. The same mysterious plans they had been hinting at since they arrived. The ones that required staying in my cabin without asking permission. The ones that felt more like an agenda than a family visit. I stepped toward her just enough that she had to meet my eyes. "You both showed up uninvited. You have moved through my space like it is yours. You expect me to serve you like a maid. That ends now, Melanie." The words tasted unfamiliar, not because I had never thought about them before, but because I had never let them leave my mouth with that level of certainty. Melanie stared at me, her lips parting as if she could not believe what she heard. For a moment, she looked genuinely stunned, the kind of stunned that comes only when someone has grown used to power they never deserved. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand gently, not aggressively, just enough to make her stop. I am not responsible for how he feels after drinking strong, organic coffee. I am not responsible for making sure your morning goes perfectly. I am not a maid, and if you want things from me, you are going to have to ask respectfully. She closed her mouth and looked away toward the ridge where the last of the sunrise glowed orange across the treetops. Her shoulders tightened, a small shiver running through her, even though she wore a robe thick enough for winter. I could hear the bathroom door open inside and Dad clearing his throat again, still uncomfortable, but no longer in distress. Melanie finally spoke, quieter this time. He will not like this. I exhaled slowly. I know. She hesitated, then walked past me into the cabin, her slippers brushing the wood planks in quick, frustrated steps. I stayed outside for a long moment, letting the cold air settle into my lungs. The morning had barely begun, and already the balance inside the cabin had shifted. For once, it was not tipping entirely in their favor. When I finally stepped back inside, Melanie had disappeared down the hallway, and the kettle on the stove hummed softly, still warm from earlier. I reached over and turned it off, listening to the faint pop of cooling metal. Somewhere behind the closed door, Dad groaned again. The consequences of a lifetime of controlling behaviors seemed to echo right through the quiet cabin. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was not the one bending anymore. I stood there in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, knowing that this was only the beginning. The morning had cracked something open, and the rest of the day was waiting. Dad groaned again behind the closed door, a low, strained sound that traveled down the hallway and settled into the quiet of the cabin. I stood still for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me, then turned toward the living room. The early light filtered through the tall windows, casting pale stripes across the wood floor. For the first time since they arrived, I felt the cabin waking up with me, not under them. I moved slowly toward the sink to rinse a cup, needing something simple to steady my hands. The water ran warm across my fingers, and for a brief second I let my shoulders relax. But when I turned off the faucet, another noise drifted in from down the hall. Not the groan of discomfort. This time it was voices. 2 of them. Low at first, sharp edges rising under the efforts to control them. I stepped closer, careful not to make the floorboards creak. Dad's voice was hushed but strained, the words tumbling out between shallow breaths. You said this would be simple. You said she would be ready to talk about selling. Melanie's reply cut through the muffled tone, crisp and impatient. She will be. She just needs a push. You are making this too dramatic. For a moment, I wondered if I had heard wrong. Selling. Push. Drama. None of those words fit the story they had told me yesterday when they barged through my front door with forced smiles. They had said they wanted family time. They had said they missed me. They had said this cabin was the perfect place to reconnect for the holiday. But nothing in their behavior had matched those words. And now, the tone behind their door sounded nothing like holiday warmth. It sounded like a strategy. Dad spoke again, his voice rising slightly. I cannot keep pretending everything is fine while we are drowning. We need that cabin listed before the end of winter. Melanie's footsteps paced back and forth, soft but irritated. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. Once she signs consent, the rest is easy. Couples run nature retreats all the time. Her name carries the social media numbers. The investment will triple. I pressed my hand against the hallway wall. Social media numbers. Consent. Investment. This cabin was not part of a family visit to reconnect. It was part of a financial plan I had never been told about. My chest tightened with a slow realization. Every sidelong glance at the walls yesterday, every comment about the kitchen size, every suggestion about upgrading the guest room, none of it was harmless. They had been evaluating the cabin like potential owners, like people preparing to turn it into something else. Dad let out a shaky breath. But she loves this place. She will not sign. Melanie's voice softened in that manipulative tone she used when she wanted someone to feel foolish. She will if she feels guilty enough. You are her dad. She wants your approval. Use that. You have to stop being sentimental. I felt something hot rise in my throat. Not quite tears, not quite rage. A heaviness of betrayal settled in my chest. I had spent yesterday cooking for them, trying to make the cabin feel warm, telling myself to give them grace even when their behavior scraped at me. And all the while they were discussing how to get their hands on my home, the one place I built for myself after years of feeling unheard. The voices grew quieter, then shifted, as if someone sat on the edge of the bed. Dad's breath came uneven, like he was battling discomfort and stress at the same time. Melanie continued speaking in a low tone, but the words were enough. We can stage it as a fresh start. Families move closer to each other all the time. She cannot keep hiding out here. It is not sustainable long term. Once we remodel, couples will pay high seasonal rates. Trust me, she owes you after everything. I stepped back from the door, feeling a coldness run through me that had nothing to do with the December air. Pause him. That was the core of it. My dad had always believed that my success, my peace, my independence, all of it was something I owed to him. And now, he had shown up, ready to leverage guilt to take the one place I had, built on my own. I needed air. I walked to the front door and stepped outside, hugging my arms against the cold. The snow along the porch rail had formed soft ridges from the wind. The sky had brightened to a pale blue, the kind of winter morning that usually brought me comfort. Not today. Today it felt like the walls of the cabin had moved, revealing something I had never seen before. As I stood there, replaying the words I had overheard, I suddenly remembered the way Melanie had picked up the tape measures she brought in her tote bag yesterday. She had measured the width of the hallway, then quietly taken a photo of the living room. At the time, I thought she was sending pictures to a friend. Now the pieces fell together with a painful clarity. Last night at dinner, she had casually said this place could be worth something. I had thought it was just another dismissive remark, but it had been literal, intentional. My breath fogged in front of me as I leaned against the porch post, trying to steady my thoughts. I knew I needed more than anger. I needed to know exactly what they were planning. Without thinking too much, I turned back inside and walked through the living room toward the guest room, where they had piled their bags. I told myself I was only checking for something simple, maybe proof of the retreat idea. Maybe evidence that this was not just fear or overreaction. My pulse thudded in my ears as I approached the small dresser. Dad always threw his jackets on top of furniture when he stayed somewhere. It was a habit that used to irritate me growing up. Now it gave me a reason to open the closet door without making noise. I reached in to pull the coat forward. As I did, a stack of papers slid out from the inside pocket and fell to the closet floor with a soft thud. I froze, then crouched slowly. The top page was a printed proposal with a title so sharp it seemed to cut the air around me. Nature Retreat Investment Model. Below it, in bold letters, was my full name. The next page listed projected profits, renovation plans, a marketing strategy built entirely around my online presence, and a timeline that assumed I would turn the cabin into a commercial property by early spring. Every page I lifted made my hands shake more. They had planned everything. They had used my name. They had used my success. They had drawn profit margins using my cabin like a piece of merchandise. And Dad had signed his initials on one of the pages, like he was already part owner. My breath hitched. I pressed the papers against my chest for a moment, letting the truth sink in. They had not come to spend Christmas with me. They had come to take what I built. They had come believing they had the right. I slid the papers back into the coat pocket and closed the closet door, quietly. Standing in that small room with the winter light creeping across the floor, I felt something inside me settle into clarity. This was not family tension. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a line being crossed, and it was not one I planned to let them cross again. I stood in the center of the guest room for a long moment, letting the weight of what I had just discovered settle inside me. The winter light had crept a little farther across the floor, sharpening the edges of the room and making everything feel too bright, too exposed. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, steady and certain. Whatever small doubts I still had dissolved right there. They had come for me. I walked back into the hallway with slow, deliberate steps. The kitchen drew me in with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the smell of coffee that still lingered in the air. Melanie stood near the counter, arranging a small plate of berries she had taken from the fridge without asking. She looked perfectly put together for someone who had been awake half the time. Night. When she saw me enter, she lifted her chin as if preparing to address an employee who had arrived. Late. She did not bother smiling. Harper, good. We need to talk. There was something in her tone that said she had rehearsed this conversation. She placed a berry on the edge of the plate with exaggerated care and continued. You are wasting your life up here. This cabin is too isolated. It is not healthy for someone your age to be so disconnected from family. Your dad and I have been talking, and we can help you. We can manage the business side, so you can do what you do best, without worrying about the rest. My fingers tightened around the back of the chair I was standing next to. The audacity in her voice was so smooth, so practiced, as if she truly believed she was offering me a gift. For a moment, I just stared at her, stunned by how easily she twisted the truth into something benevolent. She went on, warming to her own argument. Think about it. You are filming content while we handle the real responsibilities. It would free you from all this pressure. She gestured around the kitchen like it was a burden I had been shackled to, instead of the home I built with my own hands. I felt a heat rise inside me, slow but fierce. I straightened and moved toward the island, closing the distance between us. My voice came out steadier than I expected. This is my home, my channel, my work. I do not need you to manage anything for me. Melanie's expression shifted in an instant. The pleasant mask cracked, and something sharper appeared underneath. She set the plate down with a loud clatter, the berries rolling slightly. Your home, your work, your channel. She let out a short, humorless laugh. This cabin should belong to the family. Your dad has been carrying the weight of everything for years. And you have been hiding here while he deals with real problems. The accusation landed like a slap. Before I could respond, I heard Dad come out of the bathroom. His steps were slow and uneven, and when he reached the entry of the kitchen, his face was still pale. But even through his discomfort, he nodded at Melanie as if she had spoken some great truth. She is right. You need us. You cannot manage all this forever. My stomach twisted. The echo of their plan, the one I had overheard through the door, rang clearly in my mind. They were not worried about me. They were worried about what they could gain from me, from this place, from everything I had built alone. I met Dad's eyes. He looked at me with expectation, the kind he used to give when he wanted obedience, when he wanted agreement, not conversation. I saw it so clearly that it almost made my chest ache. The little girl in me recognized that look, but the woman standing in my kitchen did not owe him the response he wanted. No. The word came out firm and quiet. Quiet in a way that demanded more attention than shouting ever could. David blinked. What do you mean, no? Melanie crossed her arms, her lips tightening. Harper, do not be foolish. This is an opportunity. Families stay strong by building together. I shook my head. I am not selling this cabin. I am not signing anything. You two showed up uninvited and treated me like a maid. You do not get to make decisions about my life or my home. The silence that followed cracked through the room like ice. Melanie's face turned a shade darker. David's jaw tightened. His discomfort forgotten for a moment as anger surfaced. He stepped forward but wobbled slightly. You owe us respect after everything we have done for you. Something inside me snapped back into place just then. I straightened my shoulders. Respect goes both ways, Dad, and you have not shown me any since you arrived. Melanie let out a frustrated breath and slammed her palm lightly on the counter. Enough. Pack your things and come back with us after the holiday. This place is not good for you. Her voice rose to the same pitch people use when they realize they are losing control. I took a small step back and said calmly, You both need to pack your own things. When the sun is fully up, I want you out of my cabin. Dad's face flushed with disbelief. Melanie drew in a sharp breath as if I had said something obscene. You will regret this, Harper. Maybe, maybe not. But right then, in that cold winter kitchen, with the soft morning light spilling through the windows, I felt something I had not felt since they arrived. Control. My own voice without shame. my own boundary without apology. I turned toward the stove, giving myself a moment to breathe. Behind me, the two of them stood frozen in stunned silence. The day had only begun, and everything from here would be different. They had come to take everything I had built, and now that I knew it, I would not let them take another inch. I stayed standing there in the kitchen for a long moment, one hand resting on the back of the chair as if it were the only thing holding me upright. My pulse felt thick in my neck. The cabin seemed too quiet in those seconds, like the walls themselves had paused to listen. Outside, a gust of wind pushed against the window pane, and the branches brushed them. Glass, soft but insistent. I could not shake the feeling that the house was trying to warn me, or maybe trying to comfort me. I could not tell which. I picked up my phone again and read the email one more time. Slower this time, letting each word sink in. The agent had written it with breezy confidence. He assumed that everyone had already agreed. He assumed the inquiry was legitimate. He assumed that my dad had the right to make that decision. And that realization hit me the hardest. Dad had reached out, pretending to speak for me, pretending that this was a family matter, pretending that my signature later would just be a formality. My throat tightened the longer I looked at the screen. I felt heat gather behind my eyes. Not tears exactly, but something close. A part of me still wanted to make excuses for him, to tell myself that maybe he was desperate, or maybe Melanie had pushed him into it, or maybe he believed he was helping me somehow. But the more I thought about it, the harder it became to defend. He had made decisions about my home, my life, and my future without a single conversation. He had chosen deception over honesty. He had chosen to involve strangers over trusting me with the truth. I set the phone down and pressed both palms against my forehead. My breath slowed, deepened, then stumbled a little as the truth settled more painfully. He had not come here to reconnect. He had come here to persuade me into giving up the only real home I had ever built. And he had expected to do it without resistance. I pushed away from the table and walked to the sink, turning on the faucet. Cold water splashed over my hands. The temperature shocked me enough to steady my breathing. I cupped my hands, brought the water up to my face, and let it drip down my cheeks. For a moment, I leaned over the sink with my eyes closed, using the sound of the running water to drown out the swirl in my head. When I straightened, I stepped back and reached for a kitchen towel. The fabric was rough, but familiar. I dried my face slowly, folding the towel between my fingers as though the motion might keep my thoughts from unraveling. I walked into the living room to clear my mind. The fire from last night had burned down to ash, but a small curl of smoke still lingered in the air. I crouched to clean the hearth, brushing the cool ash into a metal bucket I kept beside the fireplace. The simple motion grounded me. The faint scrape of the metal scoop, the soft settling of ash, the rhythm of the work gave me space to think. I replayed everything Melanie had said since she arrived. The subtle digs at my lifestyle, her constant comments about space and potential, the way she had asked about my filming schedule with too much interest. Then I remembered the way she had touched the beams above the living room doorway, sliding her hand across them like she was imagining replacing them or refinishing them. Each detail seemed small on its own, but together, they formed a picture I had been too tired to see fully yesterday. I set the scoop back in its place and sank onto the couch, hands clasped together between my knees. I tried to take a deep breath, but it hitched halfway through. I was not afraid of losing the cabin. I had legal rights. I had documentation. But the betrayal sat deep, like a bruise that grew darker the longer I looked at it. My phone buzzed again. A text message this time. For a moment, I hesitated before picking it up. I half expected it to be Melanie demanding something, or Dad asking for help. But when I checked, I saw it was from an unknown number. Not a text, a voicemail notification. My stomach tightened as I clicked to listen. A man's voice came through, polite and polished. He introduced himself as the same real estate agent who had emailed earlier. He apologized for missing us yesterday and said he hoped the family was excited to move forward. Move forward. He said it with cheerful confidence, as if this were some happy plan we had all agreed to. Then he mentioned that if we wanted to take advantage of strong market conditions, we should discuss listing the property early in the new year. I hung up before the message finished. My hands trembled lightly against the phone case. Strong market conditions. Listing the property. Move forward. Every phrase made my skin tighten. Dad had not just asked about the sale. He had started the process. I stood and paced the living room, my socks brushing across the wood floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. I pressed a hand to my chest to calm the tightness there. But another thought hit me, sharp and cold. If the agent had photos of the cabin, who had taken them? When? And how? I never provided any. My channel only showed certain angles and never the full layout. I moved toward the guest room again, my breath picking up as I approached the door. I pushed it open slowly. The room was dim now, only a weak winter light spilling through the curtains. Their luggage sat by the wall, half unzipped. On the dresser, Melanie's large tote bag remained open. I knew it was wrong, but I stepped closer. My fingers hovered over the edge of the bag. Something about the way the items were arranged felt too deliberate. I nudged aside a notebook and found a thin leather folio beneath it. Inside the folio were printed photos of my cabin's interior. Clear ones, well framed, taken from angles I recognized immediately. She had taken them yesterday, when she was pretending to admire the view, pretending to be bored, pretending to wait while I cooked. A pulse thudded behind my ear. I flipped through the photos and saw handwritten notes in the margins. Measurements, estimates, ideas for structural changes, seasonal pricing models. My hands trembled harder as I closed the folio and tucked it back where it had been. I did not want them to know yet that I had discovered it, not until I understood every piece of what they were planning. I backed out of the room quietly and closed the door behind me. My breath shook as I walked down the hallway, and I rubbed my arms to warm myself. The air felt colder, sharper, and I realized I had been holding my body stiff for minutes without noticing. I returned to the living room and sat again, but this time, I could not stay still. I kept shifting, my fingers tapping against my thighs, my breath uneven. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to confront them right then. But something stronger took hold of me. I needed to stay smart. I needed to gather information. I needed to understand the full picture before making my next move. I grabbed my phone again and opened another browser tab. My fingers typed faster this time. I searched for the name of the investment retreat mentioned in the article saw earlier. More results came up. Forums, complaints, small communities discussing lost savings, people who had trusted a couple claiming they would build a wellness retreat, only to lose everything when the project fell apart. One comment stood out. It said that the woman in charge had a way of speaking that made everything sound like destiny, that she convinced people to invest by making them feel foolish for hesitating, that she believed in expansions and renovations more than people. And when it collapsed, she vanished for months before resurfacing in another state with a new husband and a new plan. I sat back as the truth hit me fully. Melanie had done this before. She had layered charm over ambition. She had masked the risk behind inspiration. She had convinced people that she was helping them, while quietly helping herself. And Dad, with his longing for success and fear of failure, had been the perfect target. A sound came from down the hall, a door closing, a floorboard shifting. I tensed, listening closely. Adam's footsteps were slower now, heavier, as if exhaustion were dragging his body. Then I heard his voice, low and tired, as he called for Melanie. I closed my eyes for a moment and inhaled deeply. My chest rose and fell with a heavy breath. When I opened my eyes, the fear I felt earlier was gone. Something steadier remained in its place. Not anger, not a shock. Resolve. I stood, letting the warmth of the living room settle across my shoulders for a moment. My hand brushed against the wooden banister as I walked toward the hallway. The truth had been revealed, and the picture was finally complete. They had come here not to guide me or support me, but to pressure me until I gave up the one thing that represented my independence. And now that I understood that clearly, everything about today looked different. I reached the edge of the hallway and paused, listening to the low murmur of their voices behind the closed door. My fingers curled slightly at my side, not in anger, but in certainty. There would be no signatures. There would be no agreement. There would be no retreat built on the foundation of my silence. The cabin was mine, and I was finally ready to protect it. I powered on my laptop and waited for the familiar hum to steady my breathing. I told myself that gathering information was just a precaution, but deep down I knew it was more than that. It was the first real step toward reclaiming control after hours of feeling cornered in my own home. When the desktop finally loaded, I opened a new folder and labeled it quietly with trembling fingers. For a second I hesitated. Then I typed the word evidence. The moment the word appeared on the screen, something shifted inside me. The fear loosened, the anger sharpened, and the fog that had clouded my thoughts since 1 a.m. began to clear with startling speed. I transferred the email from the real estate agent first. Then I dragged over the voicemail file, the photos from Melanie's folio, and the bookmarked articles. Each click felt like a small anchor dropping into place, each file a reminder that I was not imagining any of this. My hands grew steadier with each new document I saved. By the time I finished organizing everything into subfolders, my breathing had slowed, and a strange calm settled over me. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. I opened another window and pulled up my cabin's interior security camera, archive. I rarely checked it, mostly because I had never needed to. Living in the woods gave me comfort and solitude. I installed the cameras only to monitor wildlife and protect my equipment during winter storms. But now, as I scrubbed through the clips from yesterday, I realized how grateful I was that I had placed them in the living room and kitchen. The footage loaded slowly in the dim light of the cabin. I leaned closer as the images sharpened. At 10 a.m. on Christmas Eve, the door flew open, with Dad leading the way. The camera caught the exact moment he looked around, unimpressed yet entitled, waving Melanie inside like he owned the place. She walked in behind him, brushing snow off her coat, then pausing to examine my decor with that same crooked, dismissive tilt of her head I had come to know too well. I kept watching. I saw her walk around the living room, picking up objects she had no reason to touch. I watched her run her fingers along my shelves, opening drawers, inspecting things, like a woman appraising property she already believed belonged to her. I watched Dad sink into my couch and sigh loudly as though visiting his daughter required enormous effort. And then I heard it. His voice carried enough for the microphone to catch. If Harper fixed this place up, we could really do something with it. The words slid through me like a cold blade. Hearing them was different than remembering them. On the screen, Melanie turned toward him with a smile that looked rehearsed. We can guide her. She just needs direction. Guide me. The phrase tasted bitter. They had not come to help or celebrate or reconnect. They had come with a plan, and had no intention of including me in any part of it. I saved the clip. Then I skipped ahead to the moment Melanie walked into the kitchen while I cooked Christmas Eve dinner. I remembered her insulting the spices I used, the arrangement of the plates, even the way I chopped vegetables. But hearing her again through the audio made my chest tighten. It really is such a wasted opportunity, Richard. Imagine what we could do here. Wasted opportunity. My own home was reduced to a business venture she believed she deserved. I saved that clip too. Slowly, steadily, the folder on my desktop grew thicker. These were not petty grievances. These were patterns, proof, intent. When I finished collecting the footage, I sat quietly for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me. The fire had burned out completely now, leaving only the faint smell of charred wood in the air. The cabin felt colder, but also clearer, as if I had finally peeled back the layer of pretense they had tried to cast over my home. I stood and stretched my arms, my joints stiff from tension. Then I walked down the short hall to my small office nook where I kept a separate hard drive. I plugged it in and began copying everything over. It would take time, but I wanted a backup. I did not trust leaving anything solely on my laptop, not while Dad and Melanie were still here. While the files transferred, I opened my browser once more and searched Melanie's name again. This time, I dug deeper. It took several clicks and a few false leads before I found a small local article from Arizona. The tone was neutral, but the details were unmistakable. A business venture promising wellness retreats, workshops, and investment opportunities. A group of people who had invested their savings. A sudden shutdown. No refunds, no accountability. The article stopped just short of calling it fraud, but anyone who read it could see the truth through the lines. I leaned back in my chair and felt something inside me settle. Melanie was a pattern, not an accident. And Dad had walked straight into her world, blind and eager. Or maybe not blind. Maybe he had chosen to believe what she promised because it suited what he wanted. The thought hurt more deeply than I expected. I rubbed my arm, trying to shake off the heaviness. This was not the time to analyze emotions. This was the time to prepare. When the files finally finished transferring, I closed the hard drive and locked it in the drawer where I kept my camera, lenses, and extra batteries. I would move it to my car later. For now, it was safe. I stood and walked back to the living room. Morning light was beginning to edge over the tops of the pines, trying the frost on the porch rail into something pale and glittering. For a moment, I watched it, letting the cold beauty of it remind me why I lived here in the first place, why I had built a life around nature and simplicity, why I refused to let anyone take it from me. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. I picked it up and saw the contact name. Michael. My attorney. I hesitated a moment before tapping the call. It rang once, twice. Then I heard his familiar voice, calm and steady, even this early in the morning. Harper, everything is okay. I exhaled slowly. Not exactly. Tell me what happened. So I did, not all at once, not in a flood. I pieced it together in a steady line. The unannounced arrival. The way Melanie took over my kitchen, Dad's demands at 1 a.m, the herbal coffee, his reaction, the hidden proposal, the photos, the real estate agent, the article from Arizona. With each detail, Michael grew quieter, the way he always did when he was calculating. When I finally stopped talking, the silence stretched long enough for my throat to tighten. Michael, are you still there? He exhaled slowly. You do not have to be polite anymore, Harper. They crossed the line. The knot in my chest loosened. I had not realized how badly I needed someone else to say it. You need to document everything. Every conversation, every message, every action. And you cannot trust them with anything personal, not even casual details. I know. And Harper. His voice softened. You are not powerless here. The property is yours. The channel is yours. They cannot force you out. If they pressure you again, or if they try anything else, you call me immediately. I nodded, even though he could not see me. Thank you. Really. You are not alone in this. And you are not overreacting. My breath shook once, then steadied. After we hung up, I held the phone in my hand for a long moment. The sense of dread that had followed me since midnight finally began to shift into something sturdier. Something almost like strength. I set the phone down gently, stood up, and walked toward the kitchen to wipe down the counters that Melanie had cluttered earlier. The rhythmic motion soothed my nerves. Outside, the frost began to melt as the sun broke across the treetops. The day was beginning, and so was the part of this I would control. I walked from the kitchen toward the living room with a sense of intention. That surprised even me. My steps were steady, almost serene, though underneath that calm, something fierce had settled into place. The morning sun had climbed high enough to spill through the tall windows in long, warm patterns across the floor. I let the light touch my shoulders as I crossed the room. Somehow, it made the moment feel ceremonial, like the cabin itself was watching and waiting. Like it knew this was the line I finally needed to draw. Dad and Melanie were in the guest room when I called them. My voice did not raise, but it carried in a way that left no room for debate. I said, I need you both in the kitchen, now. The silence afterward stretched long enough for me to imagine them exchanging glances, Melanie calculating her next move, and Dad wondering what he had done wrong. But not ready to admit it. When they finally appeared, I was standing behind the small wooden table with a folder in front of me. Dad looked exhausted. His skin still held a pale tint, and he moved stiffly, rubbing his lower back as he sank into one of the chairs. Melanie, however, walked in with her chin lifted, wrapped in her thick winter robe, as if she were a wronged queen, summoned to a meeting she believed beneath her dignity. She crossed her arms and let out a slow exhale, clearly signaling she had little patience left. Whatever sympathy I had once felt for her dissolved the moment her eyes narrowed at the sight of the folder. "What is this about, Harper?" she asked, her tone sharp. "We have had a stressful morning. Your dad needs rest." I said nothing at first. I waited until both of them were seated. Then I pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down, slowly, folding my hands in front of me. "We are going to talk about the cabin." My voice did not shake. It surprised me a little that it did not. David blinked and straightened slightly. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Melanie shifted, as if preparing her rebuttal, but I continued before either of them could try to lead the conversation. I leaned forward and placed the folder in the center of the table. Inside are emails, screenshots, the proposal you brought into my home without my consent, the voice messages from the real estate agent you contacted using my name, and records from Arizona about a past business venture that fell apart with significant financial loss. Everything is documented. Dad's eyes widened. A slight tremor passed through his hands. Melanie's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth as if ready to argue, but the look on my face must have warned her. She closed it again, though her nostrils flared with a sharp inhale. "Richard did not mean for anything to be taken out of context," she began, but I held up a hand. "Do not speak for him. Let him respond on his own." Dad swallowed hard and looked down at the table. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint crackle of the fire I had restarted earlier. When he finally spoke, his voice came out strained and small. "Just a question." I nodded once, slowly. "You asked about market value using my name. You told the agent the family agreed. You sent photos without asking permission. You created the impression that this place was already up for discussion." Dad's shoulders slumped. He looked at his hands instead of at me. I pushed the folders slightly closer to them. "And this proposal. You and Melanie had entire projected profits planned. Renovation sketches, seasonal pricing. A business timeline ending next spring. You two did not get these ideas on the drive up here. This was planned carefully. Before you ever stepped foot on my porch." Melanie pressed her palms flat against the table. Her voice shot out sharp and defensive. "It was an opportunity. We were giving you a chance to grow. This cabin is a resource, not a sacred artifact. You are too sentimental about it. You are wasting your potential up here in the woods." I stared at her for a long moment. Then I said quietly, "This is my home, my work, my life, and neither of you had any right to plan anything involving my property without speaking to me first." Melanie scoffed and rolled her eyes. "You are being dramatic. This whole thing is unnecessary. If anything, you should be thanking us for trying to help you." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Thank you. You want me to thank you for trying to manipulate me into giving up the one thing I have built with my own hands? For lying about your intentions, for showing up uninvited and treating me like a maid, for using my name to contact a real estate agent, for planning a business on top of my land without even bothering to pretend to respect me." Melanie leaned forward, her voice rising. "You would not have given this place the life it deserves. You live here like a hermit. You have no idea what this property could be worth. We were offering you a future." Dad finally looked up from the table, his eyes red and tired. He said quietly, "We were not trying to hurt you, Harper. We just thought you would listen if we explained it later." I shook my head slowly. "You were not planning to explain anything. You were planning to pressure me until I said yes. You assumed I would fold." Melanie's face twisted. She reached for the folder, her intention clear. She wanted the papers, the evidence, anything she could grab. But before her hand touched it, I lifted my phone from the table. The screen glowed faintly. The small red dot in the corner pulsed. "Do not touch it," I said softly. Her hand froze. Her eyes flicked to the screen. She recognized what it meant. Her eyebrows snapped together, and her voice lowered to a harsh whisper. "Are you recording us?" I leaned back slightly. "Not exactly. I started a private stream. It is set to hidden mode and is time-stamped. That way nothing from today can be claimed as misremembered or taken out of context. Her eyes widened in horror. Dad looked from me to the phone and back again, not fully understanding but aware enough to feel panic rise. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You are our daughter. Because you two came here with a plan to take my home. I needed protection, legal protection. You do not get to rewrite the story later. And you will not be able to deny anything that has been said or done in this cabin since yesterday." Melanie stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor, her voice cracked with fury. "You think you are smarter than us. You think you can threaten us. You are going to regret this." She stepped toward me as if she might grab the phone, but I lifted my other hand and pointed toward the door. "Sit back down." She froze. Not because of my tone, but because of the certainty behind it. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair again, but never took her eyes off me. Phone. I reached into the folder and pulled out the printed email from the real estate agent. I slid it across the table. Dad stared at it as though the words on the page had betrayed him. Then, one by one, I placed screenshots of conversations, the proposal, the photos, and the article from Arizona. Evidence laid out like a map of every deception they had woven behind my back. David covered his face with his hands. I watched his fingers tremble slightly. He whispered something I could not make out. I waited. I did not move. Finally, he lowered his hands. His voice cracked as he said, "Harper, I did not know everything. I really did think this place could become something more. I thought it might help us all." I studied him for a long moment. I believed he was telling the truth in that he did not know everything about Melanie's past. But he knew enough. He knew he was taking something from me. He knew he was putting pressure on me. He knew he was crossing a line, and he chose to do it anyway. I let the silence stretch for several seconds. Then I spoke again, each word slow and deliberate. "Try to take my home, and I will protect myself. Legally. Publicly. And you will lose." The air seemed to freeze in the room. Melanie inhaled sharply. Dad flinched. Outside, the winter wind picked up and rattled the branches against the window as if the cabin itself wanted to punctuate the moment. I leaned back and crossed my arms. I have enough evidence to shut down any attempt to claim ownership. I have enough documentation to stop any sale. I have more than enough proof to defend myself if either of you tries anything again. Melanie snapped forward, her hand shooting out toward the folder, but before she could reach it, I tapped the phone screen, making the red light glow brighter. The movement made her stop instantly. "Sit," I repeated. She did. David put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her, but she jerked away from him. Her glare turned cold, almost venomous. She spat out, "You think this is over? You have no idea what you are doing." I met her stare without blinking. "I know exactly what I am doing." The room held a tension so sharp it felt like glass. Dad looked between us, torn between guilt and fear. Melanie looked like she wanted to leap across the table, but could not risk the recording. I kept my breathing steady, my spine straight, my hands loose but ready. After several long moments, I gathered the papers and placed them neatly back into the folder. Then I locked eyes with both of them. From this moment forward, nothing happens in this cabin without my permission. Not one decision, not one plan, not one conversation about my future. Dad opened his mouth to argue, but the look I gave him stopped the words before they formed. He closed it again and stared at the table. Melanie pressed her fingers into the edge of her chair so hard, her knuckles turned white. She looked at me with a cold, focused anger that told me she was not used to losing. Not to anyone. And especially not to someone she underestimated as badly as she underestimated me. The clock on the stove ticked softly in the background. The kettle on the counter pinged as it cooled. The cabin, usually so comforting and quiet, felt like it had become the setting for a battle none of us had expected. I stood slowly, tucking the folder under my arm. David watched me with tired eyes. Melanie followed every move, calculating, seething. I walked to the end of the table and paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. This ends now. I turned and walked toward my office nook to store the folder in a locked drawer. Behind me, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched long and tight, and with each step I took, I could feel the balance of power shifting, for the first time since they arrived. When I closed the drawer, the soft click echoed louder than I expected. It felt final, defining, irreversible. And as I turned back toward the living room, I knew the next move would not be theirs. It would be mine. David and Melanie stayed frozen in the kitchen long after I had walked away, but I did not turn back to look at them. I kept my posture steady as I crossed the living room and placed the locked folder deeper into the drawer beneath my desk. My hands lingered on the wooden edge for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle inside me. The tension in the cabin felt thick, as if the air itself had heard every word spoken, and now held them suspended. It was almost noon. Christmas Day, a day that should have felt warm and joyful and safe. Instead, it carried the heaviness of betrayal and the strange calm that follows a storm. When I finally stepped back into the main room, David was standing near the table with his shoulders slumped, his hands resting heavily on the back of the chair where he had sat earlier. Melanie remained seated, but she was rigid, her spine straight and her face pinched with anger. She had not figured out how to swallow. The two of them looked like people who had arrived with confidence and purpose, only to find themselves suddenly on unfamiliar ground. Neither knew what to say, neither knew how to regain control, and neither had the courage to challenge me now. I stood quietly by the counter for a moment, waiting to see if one of them would speak. Dad finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, the corners strained, and the lines around his mouth deeper than usual. He looked tired, in a way that went far beyond the effects of the coffee or the tense morning. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he let out a slow, defeated breath and lowered his eyes again. Melanie glanced between us, her jaw tightening. Then she stood, abruptly, her robes swaying as she grabbed her purse from the floor. "This is ridiculous. We are leaving." Her tone cracked on the last word. Not with sadness, but with frustration at losing the upper hand. David nodded slowly, as if he did not know what else to do. They moved down the hallway and into the guest room. I stayed where I was, listening to the muffled sounds of zippers, hurried footsteps, and drawers closing. The noises were sharp and jarring against the quiet of the cabin. Every thud and scrape carried the weight of years of unspoken tension rising to the surface. My heart felt heavy, but not with regret, more with the gravity of realizing just how far they had been willing to go. I folded my arms and leaned back against the counter, letting myself exhale fully for the first time in hours. Outside, a small gust of wind rustled the branches, scattering a thin layer of snow from the pines. I stared out the window, letting the view steady me. When they emerged, they were dressed for the cold again. Coats zipped, scarves tightened, luggage dragged behind them in stiff jerks. Melanie did not look at me as she passed through the living room. Her chin stayed lifted, her eyes fixed forward, as if the mere act of looking in my direction might acknowledge her defeat. Dad, however, paused. He stood there holding his duffel bag with both hands, the strap cutting into his shoulder. He looked at me with a kind of hollow confusion, like a man who had expected to shape the world in his image and found, instead, that the world no longer bent for him. His lips parted slightly. "Harper," he said softly. His voice cracked on my name. I waited. He swallowed, looked down at the floor, then back at me. His mouth opened again, then closed, without a word. It was as though the apology he wanted to give had become tangled with pride and guilt, unable to form, or perhaps he did not yet know how to apologize for something he had convinced himself was justified. I stood still. I did not speak. I did not soften my expression. He had spent years expecting me to bend, to give in for the sake of peace, to carry the burden of repair. But this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to the girl I once was, and the woman I had fought to become. Dad let out a soft sigh, barely audible, then nodded. A small gesture of acknowledgement or surrender, I could not tell. He followed Melanie toward the door. The cold air swept in briefly when it opened. Then the door shut behind them with a soft, but final, click. The silence afterward was immense, thick, heavy. but also strangely clean. I walked to the window and watched them load their bags into the back of their car. Melanie moved quickly, her motions sharp. Dad moved slow, pausing once to brace his hand on the roof of the car as if steadying himself. The engine rumbled to life. Then the car rolled down the driveway, tires crunching through the thin layer of snow until the vehicle disappeared behind the bend of trees. I stood there for a long time, watching the empty driveway, feeling the quiet settle not only in the cabin, but in my chest. For the first time in years, I realized I did not feel torn between love and fear, between duty and boundaries. I felt something close to freedom, but it was not the jubilant kind. It was quieter, heavier, sadder. I closed the curtains gently and turned away from the window. When I took my first steps away from the living room, I expected to feel triumphant, but instead I felt something closer to relief mixed with sorrow. River that the confrontation was over. Sorrow that it had needed to happen at all. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands shook slightly as I took the first sip. The cabin felt different now. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the imbalance that had filled it since yesterday was gone. It felt like my home again, mine in a way that felt reclaimed rather than simply owned. Still, as I stood there, I knew I needed something more than the silence. I needed closure. Not from them, but from myself. I had spent years folding pieces of myself to make room for their expectations, years trying to find some middle ground between who I was and who they wanted me to be. That version of me had carried too much, and I needed to let her speak. I walked toward my small filming corner in the living room. The soft ring light stood beside the tripod, adjusted from yesterday's work. The backdrop of the cabin interior, warm wood and winter light, looking exactly like the kind of setting my viewers expected. But today, I was not making a nature video or a quiet lifestyle piece. Today, I was letting myself talk honestly for the first time in a long time. I lowered myself onto the wooden chair and inhaled slowly. My breath felt heavy with everything that had happened, but also steady enough to share. I reached for the camera and pressed the record button. The small red light blinked once. I looked straight into the lens. My voice came out softer than usual, almost shaky. I said I did not script this. I did not have a lesson prepared, or a theme, or a plan. I just need to be honest with you all about something personal. Not naming names, not calling out anyone, just the truth, real truth, the kind that we sometimes hide because we convince ourselves it is easier. The room was silent, except for my voice. I continued, letting the words form themselves. I talked about boundaries, the invisible ones, and the ones we try to ignore for the sake of keeping peace. I talked about the quiet ways family can make you feel small, the subtle comments that build up over time, the pressure to be grateful, even when you feel dismissed. I talked about how easy it is to lose your voice when the people you love insist they know your life better than you do. I paused, feeling my throat tighten slightly. Then I said what I had never said out loud before. I allowed myself to outgrow the version of me they preferred. And sometimes that means they do not recognize you anymore. Sometimes they resent it. Sometimes they push harder, but you still have to protect the parts of yourself they refuse to see. The words felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. I talked for nearly 20 minutes. Not crying, not angry, just open, just real. When I finished, I let the camera roll for a few seconds before reaching out and pressing stop. The silence after the recording ended felt comforting, like the cabin understood what I needed. I transferred the video to my laptop and edited lightly, removing pauses but leaving the raw emotion intact. Then I uploaded the video to my channel with a title that felt honest: Reflections on Boundaries at Christmas. No names, no accusations, just my truth. When I clicked publish, something in my chest loosened again. It took less than 30 minutes for comments to start appearing. Words of encouragement, stories from women who had been through something similar, note from people who had felt dismissed by family members and were just now learning how to protect themselves. The majority came from viewers my age or older, especially women over 45 who seemed to understand immediately the messy complexity of loving people who do not always love you in ways that feel safe. By the time an hour had passed, The video had tripled the engagement of my usual uploads. My inbox is filled with messages. The community section of my channel glowed with support. I scrolled slowly through the comments, letting their words settle into the heavy places inside me. "You made me feel seen. Thank you for your honesty. I needed to hear this today." I sat back and pressed my hand to my chest, letting the warmth of those words soothe me. For the first time since last night, my body finally felt like it was releasing the tension it had held. I felt grounded. Not happy, but grounded in a way that made it possible to breathe fully again. I stood and walked toward the fireplace, lighting a new log and sitting cross-legged on the rug as the flames caught. The warmth radiated through the room as the wood crackled softly. This, I thought, is what home is supposed to feel like. Not tension, not fear, not hidden intentions or family manipulation. Just warmth. Just safety. My phone vibrated beside me on the rug. I reached for it without thinking, expecting another comment notification. Instead, I saw a familiar name in the subject line. It was from Dad. I hesitated for a full 10 seconds before opening it. The message was short, just one line. "Maybe I went too far. I am sorry." The words sat there on the screen, simple and incomplete. Not enough to erase anything, not enough to repair the damage, but enough to show that he had felt something. Regret, or fear, or confusion. I did not know which. I stared at the message for a long moment. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but I did not press it. Not today. I set the phone face down on the rug. The fire crackled softly beside me. The cabin breathed quietly around me. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt the calm that comes not from resolution, but from reclaiming what was always mine. The next days moved slowly and gently, like the snow that sometimes fell in thin, quiet layers outside my windows. The cabin seemed to exhale with me. Every room felt different now that the tension was gone. I woke up when I chose to wake up. I made coffee the way I liked it, not to anyone else's demands. I filmed when inspiration came, not because somebody ordered me to turn my life into content for their benefit. A week after Christmas, I was sitting at my small table with my laptop open and a mug of tea cooling beside me when an email from Michael appeared at the top of my inbox. I had just finished answering comments on the boundary video, and my eyes were already tired. But his name made my attention sharpen immediately. I clicked it and leaned back as I read. He wrote that he wanted to give me a heads up, his words calm and measured like always. A woman who had invested in Melanie's old retreat project in Arizona had filed a fresh complaint, this time with a state office that had more authority to investigate. Another victim had finally had enough and spoken up in the right place. Because of that new complaint, some of the earlier reports were being pulled and combined. Melanie's name had resurfaced in a very official way. I read the message twice. A strange mix of emotions rolled through me. Part of me felt a deep heaviness for the people she had hurt. I thought of that investor, probably staring at old emails and empty promises. Finally finding the energy to say this was not right, and I deserved better. Another part of me felt a quiet, undeniable sense of justice. Karma does not always arrive in a blaze of glory. Sometimes it comes wrapped in paperwork and quiet investigations, in office lights and case numbers. But it comes. Michael added that my documentation about the cabin plan could be important. If Melanie or my dad tried to spin any story about me or about the proposed retreat here, he said I had done the right thing by saving everything and drawing a clear line. The words made my chest loosen a little. I had not destroyed anyone. I had simply refused to be their next victim. I closed the laptop halfway and stared at the grain of the table for a while. Melanie was facing consequences for something she had done long before she set her sights on my cabin. That felt important to acknowledge. Her choices had hurt other people, not just me. Whatever happened now was not my doing. It was her past finally catching up. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was outside bringing in firewood. I balanced an armful of logs against my chest, set them in the metal basket, and wiped my hands on my jeans before checking the screen. It was a message from Dad. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. The memory of his short email on Christmas, the one I had chosen not to answer, sat quietly in the back of my mind as I read the new one. He wrote that the drive back after Christmas had been rough, that the house felt different now, that he had watched my video, the one about boundaries and respect and family pressure, even though I had not mentioned him by name. He said it was hard to see himself reflected in the stories I described, and harder to admit that he recognized his own behavior in the way I talked about being dismissed. He said he wanted to try to fix things. He did not use the word apologize directly, but he circled around it. He wrote that maybe he had let his fear about money and aging and relevance turn into something ugly. Maybe he had listened to someone who promised big solutions because he did not want to feel like he had failed. He said he missed me, that he did not want this distance to be permanent. For a second, the little girl in me reacted first. The part that had always wanted his approval felt a sudden sting behind my eyes. But the woman who had just fought to keep her home and her sanity lifted her head and read those lines with a different kind of strength. I stood there in the doorway with my back to the cold air and my face toward the fire, scrolling through his words slowly. When I finished, I did not reply right away. I let my mind settle around the question that mattered most. Did I trust that he could change without real help? The answer was clear, even through the ache. I sat down on the rug in front of the fireplace, watching the flames lick the logs. The heat warmed my knees, my hands, the sides of my face. I pulled in a deep breath and let it out slowly before typing my response. I told him that I heard him and that I hoped he was truly willing to look at himself honestly. I said that I was not interested in pretending Christmas had been a misunderstanding. It had not. It had been a clear expression of choices he and Melanie had made long before. They arrived at my cabin. I wrote that if he genuinely wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would have to be built on new ground, not on guilt or obligation. Then I told him something that made my fingers tremble slightly as I typed. I said that I was willing to consider moving towards some kind of repair, but only if he agreed to go to family therapy with me. Not once. Regularly. With a professional who could help us see the patterns we had both been blind to for years. I wrote that I would not discuss selling my cabin. I would not hear one more word about retreat business or managing my channel, or what he thought I should do with my life. If he wanted to talk, we could talk about the past and the ways it still hurt, with support. We could talk about the present and how to build something different, but not while he pretended nothing serious had happened. I ended the message by saying that I loved him, but I loved myself too, and I was not willing to sacrifice my own peace for his comfort anymore. My thumb hovered over send for a moment. Then I pressed it. The message left with a soft whoosh. I set the phone down beside me on the rug and stayed there, watching the flames move. Minutes passed. Maybe 20, maybe 30. The phone stayed still. Eventually, a reply came in, shorter than his first one. He wrote that he needed time to think about therapy, that it sounded serious, that he was not sure he was ready for that. But he did not say no. He did not lash out. He did not call me ungrateful or dramatic or accuse me of turning people against him. That alone felt like a small, fragile step in the right direction. I wrote back that he could take all the time he needed, but my boundary was not going to move. Then I put the phone on silent and tucked it under a pillow. I needed the rest of that day for myself. The next morning, I woke before dawn without an alarm. For a second, my mind shot back to that Christmas morning when Dad had pounded on my door, ordering me to get up and make coffee for his perfect sunrise. For a heartbeat or two, my chest tightened, old habits bracing for impact. Then I remembered where I was and who was not here. No one was pounding on my door. No one was waiting to critique my coffee or inspect my table settings. No one was rehearsing ways to pry my life out of my hands. The cabin was still. The air was quiet. The morning was mine. I pulled on thick socks and a sweater and padded into the kitchen. The world outside the windows was still dark, the faintest hint of blue coloring the sky. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then ground my favorite beans slowly, breathing in the smell. The sound was gentle, rhythmic, and grounding. There was no rush, no demand, just the simple comfort of a small routine I chose. When the water boiled, I poured it over the grounds in my old ceramic dripper and watched the steam rise in thin curls. The smell of coffee filled the room, rich and warm. I wrapped my hands around the mug when it was ready, letting the heat seep into my fingers. Instead of setting up the table on the porch like I had done for Dad and Melanie, I took just one mug and one small plate with a slice of leftover cranberry bread. I draped a scarf around my shoulders, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold. The morning air bit at my cheeks and nose, but it felt clean, like it had been washed overnight. The trees stood dark and tall against the lightening sky. A thin layer of snow sparkled on the railings and the ground. I walked to the edge of the porch and sat in my usual spot, tucking my feet up under me on the chair. I sipped my coffee and watched as the first sliver of sun peeked over the end ridge. The sky shifted from deep blue to shades of purple and pink and gold. The world felt big and quiet at the same time. This was the sunrise I wanted. Not perfect for a video, not staged for anyone's social media plan, just mine. For a moment, I let myself remember that morning when Dad had barked orders about the perfect view and the 5 a.m. table setup. The bitterness I had felt then flickered at the edges of my mind. But instead of letting it take over, I chose to see this moment as the answer to that one. Back then, I had been bending under their weight. Now, I was sitting here, free, with my hands steady around my own mug, and my life still where it belonged. Revenge, I realized, was not the satisfaction of seeing them suffer. That feeling, even when it flickered through me, had never lasted long and never felt clean. The deeper, quieter revenge was living my life untouched by their schemes. It was knowing that their attempt to take everything had ended with them, driving away in silence while I stayed in the home I had built, surrounded by the life I had created, unbroken. It was in the fact that I had not exploded online and named them or dragged them through the mud. I had simply told the truth of my experience and drawn a line. Their choices had consequences elsewhere. Melanie now faced questions from people she had hurt long before me. Dad had been forced to look at himself in ways he had avoided for years, and I had kept my dignity. As the sun climbed high, I thought about all the small ways I would protect myself from here on out. Better locks on the doors, maybe? Stronger contracts and clearer boundaries with anyone who wanted to. Collaborate. But more than those practical things, it would be the internal boundary that mattered most. The one that said, you cannot just walk into my life and rearrange it for your comfort. Not anymore. That afternoon, I filmed a short follow-up for my viewers. Nothing long, just a gentle reflection on what it means to hold your ground, even when the people pushing against you are the ones you love. I talked about how complicated it can be to set limits with parents, step-parents, siblings, and children. How loyalty sometimes gets confused with obedience, and how sacrifice can quietly turn into self-erasure if you are not careful. I said that protecting yourself is not cruelty, it is clear, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to refuse to participate in a pattern that harms you. When I finished recording, I sat for a while in front of the camera, just listening to the hum of the cabin. My heart felt bruised, but clean. The anger had cooled into something steadier. I knew the road with Dad would not be simple, not even if he agreed to therapy eventually. I knew Melanie would never see me as anything but an obstacle. That was her burden, not mine. I closed my eyes and thought about the women who had filled my comment section with their own stories in the past week. Stories of mothers who belittled them, siblings who used them, partners who tried to control every decision. Some had cut ties completely. Others were still in the middle of the storm, unsure which way to turn. I opened my eyes again and leaned closer to the camera for the last part of my message, the part I wanted them all to hear most clearly. I told them that their boundaries mattered, not as a buzzword or a trendy phrase, but as a real, vital part of staying whole. I said that if they had ever been told they were too much or not enough for their own family, they were not alone. I reminded them that silence can sometimes be power, that choosing not to engage in certain conversations or not to respond to certain provocations can be a way of reclaiming control instead of surrendering it. Then I spoke directly, as if each listener was sitting across the table from me with a warm drink in her hands. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. I ended the recording there, letting the words linger in the quiet of the cabin. Outside, the light had shifted into late afternoon gold. Inside, the fire crackled softly. I sat for a moment longer, feeling both the weight and the lightness of everything I had said. Then I reached out, stopped the camera, and let the cabin fall back into its familiar, comfortable quiet. Confident that the story was no longer just mine. It now belonged to every woman who had ever closed her own door, taken a deep breath, and decided that her life, her home, and her boundaries were worth protecting.